Welcome to Stories of Almost, where every story begins with a single question. What if? Today's story is, I gave my children everything, except what they needed most. It's a journey through the life that might have been, the choices that changed everything, and the quiet hope we can discover in the life we're living. Before we begin, remember this: every life has an almost. Perhaps this story will remind you that your own story is far from over. If you enjoy heartfelt stories that stay with you long after they end, consider subscribing so you never miss a new journey. Now, let's begin. Natalie was 8 years old when she began measuring happiness by the cars parked outside someone else's school. Every weekday morning, she left home with her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders and her mother calling after her from the front porch. "Don't forget your lunch." "I won't." "And your spelling test." "I studied." "You studied for 6 whole minutes while eating cereal." Natalie grinned. 7. Her mother laughed and shook her head. "That's my girl." Their little brick house sat on a quiet street, where neighbors waved from their driveways and dogs barked at cats with great determination. It wasn't fancy, but it always smelled like fresh coffee in the mornings and something good cooking by dinner time. Natalie barely noticed those things anymore. The walk to Brooks Elementary took about 15 minutes. Halfway there, she passed another school. It sat behind tall black iron gates with perfectly trimmed hedges and flower beds that always seemed to be blooming, no matter the season. St. Joseph's Academy. Every morning, expensive cars lined the curb, large SUVs, luxury sedans. The kind of cars Natalie only recognized because television commercials made them look important. Children stepped out wearing crisp navy uniforms without a wrinkle in sight. Their shoes shined. Their backpacks matched. Some carried violin cases. Others held steaming cups of hot chocolate while parents kissed them goodbye before driving away. Natalie slowed her steps almost every morning. She imagined what it must feel like to walk through those gates. One girl wore sneakers Natalie had begged for months earlier. Another had the newest backpack with colorful patches all over it. A boy climbed out of a sleek black car, laughing so hard with his father that he nearly forgot his lunch. Natalie watched until the last student disappeared inside. Then she looked down at her own sneakers. They were clean. Her mother always scrubbed them on Sunday afternoons, but they weren't new. She sighed before continuing toward Brooks Elementary. That afternoon, while eating peanut butter sandwiches with her best friend Lily, Natalie asked, "Do you think kids at St. Joseph's ever get homework?" Lily stared at her. "They're in school." "I know." "So, of course they do." Natalie frowned. "But everything else looks easier." Lily shrugged. "My cousin goes there." Natalie's eyes widened. "Really?" "She says the math tests are awful." Natalie blinked. That didn't seem right. How could anyone with shoes like that have awful math tests? When school ended, she walked home still thinking about the children behind those gates. That evening, her father was outside trying to convince the old lawnmower to start. It coughed, growled, stopped. He pulled the cord again. Nothing. Natalie stood with her hands on her hips. "I think it's dead," her father chuckled. "It still has some life left." "So what's the plan?" "I'm going to threaten it." "Does that work?" "Never. But it makes me feel better." Natalie laughed. A minute later, the mower finally roared to life. Her father raised both hands in victory. "See, it heard me." She clapped dramatically before catching herself and giggling. "You're funny." "So, your mother tells me." Inside, the kitchen smelled of tomato soup and grilled cheese. Her mother, Cynthia, slid sandwiches onto plates. "Wash your hands. They're clean. They touched your father's lawnmower." Natalie looked at her palms. "How do you always know?" Dinner was noisy in the comfortable way families often are. Her father told a story about accidentally waving at a stranger who spent 5 full minutes talking to him because they both thought they knew each other. Cynthia laughed so hard Natalie laughed too. By bedtime, the story had already become family history. Still, the next morning she slowed again outside St. Joseph's Academy. This time a little girl stepped out wearing shiny white shoes with silver stars along the sides. Natalie's heart sank. Those were the exact shoes she'd circled in the store catalogue. She could almost picture herself wearing them. That weekend, while shopping with Cynthia, she quietly picked up the display shoe. "They're pretty," she said. "They are." Natalie waited. Her mother looked at the price tag. Her smile softened. "Oh." Natalie knew that "oh" it meant no. Cynthia knelt beside her. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's okay. I know you really like them." Natalie nodded without speaking. Her mother gently squeezed her hand. "Maybe another time." Natalie smiled because she didn't want her mother to feel bad. "It's okay. I like my shoes." It wasn't entirely true. On the drive home, neither of them said much. That evening, Cynthia found Natalie reading on her bed. She sat beside her. "I hate disappointing you." "You didn't." "I know that look." Natalie closed her book. "You always know." "I usually do." For a long moment they simply sat together. Then Natalie leaned over and hugged her mother. Cynthia hugged her back without asking questions. "I'm lucky to have you," she whispered. Natalie held on tightly. "So am I." She meant it. She really did. But after her mother turned off the bedroom light and quietly closed the door, Natalie stared at the ceiling. She imagined a different future, a bigger house, beautiful birthday parties, new clothes whenever her children wanted them. Vacations with beaches she'd only seen in magazines, no apologies over shoes, no looking at price tags first. She whispered into the darkness, almost like she was telling a secret to the future. "When I'm a mother," she paused, "my children will have everything." The words settled into her heart with surprising certainty. The following Monday morning, Natalie reached the corner where she always slowed her pace. The gates of St. Joseph's stood open. Parents smiled. Children hurried inside. Everything looked polished. Everything looked effortless. Natalie watched for one extra minute before turning toward her own school. She believed she had just seen the perfect childhood. Without realizing it, an 8-year-old girl had already begun building the life she hoped one day to give her own children. The years carried Natalie forward in the quiet way they often do. One birthday became another. School gave way to college, college to her first job, and before she knew it, the little girl who used to stop outside St. Joseph's Academy was an adult hurrying into an office every morning with coffee in one hand and a notebook in the other. She liked being busy. She liked checking things off lists. Most of all, she liked the feeling that she was building something. One Friday afternoon, a co-worker convinced her to attend a community fundraiser at the local museum. "You spend too much time working," her friend Esther said. "I like working." "I know. So why am I here?" "Because they have free desserts." Natalie laughed. Now that's a convincing argument. She met Theo Anderson while reaching for the last chocolate brownie. "You can have it," he said, stepping back. "No, you saw it first." "I've already had 2. She raised an eyebrow. "You admitted that awfully fast." "I believe honesty builds trust." "And brownies? They build happiness." She laughed again. That was the first thing she noticed about Theo. Life seemed lighter around him. Over the following months, they discovered they enjoyed long walks, old movies, farmers' markets, and conversations that somehow wandered from history to breakfast cereal without either of them noticing. Theo taught history at the local high school. He loved stories, not famous ones, ordinary ones. He could spend 10 minutes telling Natalie about an elderly couple who danced together every Saturday in the town square. "You always notice people," Natalie once said. "They're interesting. You make everyone sound interesting." "They usually are," she smiled. "I think that's your superpower. I was hoping for flying." You got storytelling instead. I'll take it. Before long, their weekends belonged to each other. Several months later, Theo proposed during a picnic at the park. There were no musicians hiding behind trees, no crowd waiting to applaud, just sandwiches, lemonade, and a ring that almost slipped from his fingers because he was nervous. I practiced this speech, he admitted. You did? I forgot all of it, she laughed. So, is there any part you remember? He took a slow breath. I know I want to grow old laughing with you. Natalie didn't need the rest. Yes. They were married the following spring in a small church surrounded by family and friends. Cynthia cried before Natalie even reached the aisle. I haven't even done anything yet, Natalie whispered when she hugged her afterward. I know, Cynthia sniffled. I'm preparing. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Theo taught school. Natalie continued climbing through the company where she'd started several years earlier. Then came Sarah. The moment the nurse placed the tiny baby into Natalie's arms, the world seemed to become very quiet. Theo looked down at his daughter with wide eyes. I think she has your nose, Natalie smiled. I think she looks like a sleepy potato. Theo nodded thoughtfully. Also true. They both laughed. A couple of years later, John arrived with a loud cry and enough energy to keep everyone awake. Sarah adored her little brother. She insisted on helping. Her version of helping usually involved handing Theo diapers upside down. He accepted them anyway. You know, he whispered to baby John one afternoon, your sister means well. Sarah clapped her hands. Natalie watched them from the kitchen and felt something warm settle inside her. This was everything she'd dreamed about. For a while, life felt wonderfully ordinary. There were bedtime stories, Saturday pancakes, trips to the playground, blanket forts in the living room. The children didn't care that the blankets kept falling down. Neither did Theo. Natalie loved those moments. But as Sarah grew older and John began preschool, expenses seemed to multiply. One evening, Natalie sat at the dining table surrounded by bills. Theo placed 2 mugs of tea beside her. I made the fancy kind. We have fancy tea. We do now. She smiled without looking up. I've been offered another promotion. That's wonderful. It comes with more responsibility. And longer hours? She hesitated. A little. Theo pulled out the chair beside her. We're doing okay. I know. We don't have to say yes to everything. Natalie stared at the figures on the paper. She remembered the polished shoes outside St. Joseph's, the violin cases, the smiling parents. I want the kids to have opportunities. They already do. I mean more. Theo reached for her hand. Natalie, I don't want Sarah wondering why another child has something she doesn't. I understand. And John too. He squeezed her fingers. I know where this comes from. She looked at him. I just want them to have every chance. Theo smiled softly. Of course. She accepted the promotion. Months passed. The extra paycheck paid for piano lessons Sarah had begged to try. Soon after, John joined a soccer club. The following summer, they took a vacation by the ocean. Natalie stood watching her children chase waves across the sand. She smiled. This was what she'd imagined all those years ago. As time went on, another promotion arrived. Then another. Their home grew larger. The children attended an excellent private school. Birthday parties became easier to plan because money wasn't quite so tight anymore. Natalie felt relieved every time she could say yes instead of no. One evening, she arrived home after sunset. Theo was washing dinner dishes while Sarah colored at the table. John had fallen asleep on the couch. Long day? Theo asked. She sighed. The longest. Sarah looked up. Mom? I'm here. You missed my piano song. Natalie stopped. I'm sorry, sweetheart. It's okay. Sarah smiled. I can play it tomorrow. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Theo quietly folded laundry. They asked about you tonight. Natalie looked over. I see. They understand you're working. I'm doing this for them. I know you are. She waited. Theo smiled gently. They don't need explaining. What do they need? They just miss their mom. Natalie looked toward the hallway where both children were sleeping. It's only for a little while, she said. Once we're comfortable, I'll slow down. Theo nodded. I hope you do. She believed every word she had spoken. She truly thought there would always be time later. The years slipped by so naturally that Natalie hardly noticed how quickly Sarah and John were changing. One season, they were asking Theo to check for imaginary monsters under the bed. The next, Sarah was reading chapter books on her own, while John insisted he was old enough to pour his own cereal, even if half of it landed on the counter. Their home changed too. The little starter house had become a place filled with light, family photographs, and enough room that no one had to share a bedroom anymore. The backyard held a swing Theo built one autumn afternoon after watching an online tutorial 3 times. It leans a little, Natalie said, watching him tighten one last bolt. It's artistic. I don't think swings are supposed to be artistic. It gives it character. Sarah tested it first. It works, Theo smiled proudly. I never doubted it. Natalie laughed. That's because you finished fixing it 5 seconds ago. Life felt comfortable, not extravagant, comfortable. And Natalie liked that feeling because it meant saying yes more often. When Sarah asked if she could take piano lessons with her best friend, Natalie signed her up before the week was over. When John wanted to join a traveling soccer team, she found room in the budget. Every birthday included something special. Every Christmas had at least one surprise that made the children's eyes grow wide. Sometimes Natalie caught herself smiling as she watched them unwrap gifts. She wasn't just watching Sarah and John. She was quietly keeping a promise she'd made years before. One Saturday morning, she surprised the family with tickets to an amusement park. John ran circles around the kitchen shouting, "We're really going?" Theo looked at Natalie. "You've created a small tornado." "I noticed." Sarah wrapped her arms around her mother. "This is going to be the best day ever." It almost was. They laughed through roller coasters, shared giant bowls of popcorn, and took turns pretending not to be scared on the tallest ride. Theo insisted he wasn't frightened. The photograph taken during the biggest drop suggested otherwise. When they looked at it later, Sarah laughed so hard she could barely breathe. "Dad, I was concentrating." "Your eyes are closed." "I concentrate with my eyes closed." That picture stayed on the refrigerator for years. Natalie loved days like that. She wished there were more of them, but work kept asking for a little more responsibility, a little more travel, a few more evenings. She always believed it would settle down after the next project, or the one after that. By early autumn, Sarah's school announced its annual student art show. For weeks, colourful drawings covered the dining room table. "What do you think?" Sarah asked one evening, holding up a painting of a lake at sunset. Natalie studied it carefully. "I think you're getting better every time. You always say that, because it's true." Sarah smiled. "Will you come to the art show?" Natalie looked at the calendar. The answer was already sitting there in black ink, a meeting out of town. She stared at it longer than she needed to. "I'll do everything I can." Sarah nodded. "Okay." The morning of the art show, Natalie packed her suitcase with a heaviness she couldn't quite explain. Before leaving, she kissed Sarah on the forehead. "Take lots of pictures." "I will. I'll be home tomorrow." Sarah smiled. "Good luck with your meeting." It was such a grown-up thing to say that Natalie almost laughed. That evening, while parents wandered through the school gym, admiring paintings, Sarah carefully placed an empty folding chair beside Theo. "Who's sitting there?" one of her classmates asked. "My mom." "Oh, she's running a little late." Theo heard the conversation but said nothing. The chair remained empty all evening. When Natalie returned home the following afternoon, she found Sarah's painting resting on the kitchen counter. A blue ribbon hung from one corner. "You won," Sarah shrugged. "Second place." Natalie hugged her. "I'm so proud of you." "I know." There was that phrase again, gentle and sincere. Natalie reached into her bag. "I brought you something." Inside was a beautiful set of professional paintbrushes. Sarah's face lit up. "They're amazing." "I'm sorry I missed yesterday." "It's okay." Sarah hugged the brushes against her chest. "They're beautiful." Natalie smiled with relief. A few weeks later, it was John's turn. His soccer team reached the championship game. "I think we're going to win," he announced at breakfast. Theo buttered his toast. "Confidence? I like it. I'm scoring today." Natalie checked the time. "I'll leave as soon as my meeting ends." John nodded. "You'll make the second half." "I promise I'll try." The meeting ran longer. Traffic moved slower. Natalie glanced at the dashboard clock every few minutes. By the time she reached the field, children were already shaking hands. John stood near the sidelines holding his medal. His eyes searched the parking lot before finding her. "You won." He smiled. "We did." "I'm sorry." "It's okay." He handed her the medal. "Feel it." "It's heavier than I expected." "We all said that." Theo walked over carrying folding chairs. "You just missed his goal." Natalie looked at John. "You scored?" He nodded. "It was a good one." "I wish I'd seen it." "It's okay." Again. "It's okay." The words comforted her. But later that evening, after the children were asleep, Theo quietly placed the soccer medal on the kitchen counter. "They're wonderful kids. They really are. They never make you feel guilty." Natalie looked down. "I know." Theo rested his hand on the back of a chair. "I've started noticing something." "What?" "Our happiest days always seem to be the ones when we're all together." She smiled. "That's because we're a family." "We are." He hesitated. "I just hope we don't spend so much time planning tomorrow that we miss today." Natalie reached for his hand. "It won't always be this busy." "I hope not." "So do I." She believed it with all her heart. Life had finally become everything she had dreamed of giving her children. She simply couldn't see how quietly childhood was moving from one season to the next, asking for nothing more than ordinary days together. The children didn't seem to grow 1 year at a time anymore. One day, Sarah was asking Theo to help braid her hair before school. The next, she was taller than her mother and politely asking if she could borrow the car to meet friends at the library. John had traded toy dinosaurs for soccer cleats and spent half his afternoons kicking a ball around the backyard until someone called him inside. The house was still full. It was simply quieter in different ways. Family dinners became harder to arrange. Sarah often stayed upstairs finishing homework or adding another brushstroke to whatever painting covered her easel that week. John's soccer practices stretched later into the evening, and weekends seemed to disappear beneath games, birthday parties, and time with friends. Natalie noticed the changes, but smiled to herself. This was what happened when children grew up. At least that's what she believed. One Friday evening, Theo stood in the kitchen stirring a pot of chili while glancing toward the staircase. "Should I call everyone?" Natalie looked up from her laptop. "They'll come." Theo smiled. "You always sound more confident than I feel." A few minutes later he called, "Dinner?" Sarah appeared first. "I'll eat fast," she said. "Tia's waiting for me online so we can finish our history project." John walked in carrying a soccer ball. "Coach added extra practice tomorrow morning." Theo looked around the table. "It feels like I should make reservations just to have dinner with my own family." John laughed. "Can I reserve Tuesdays?" Sarah smiled. "I'll take Thursdays." Natalie joined in the laughter. Theo pointed his spoon toward them. "I'm serious." "We're right here," John replied. "For tonight." The conversation drifted to school, weekend plans, and whether Theo had accidentally bought spicy chili instead of mild. "I didn't," he insisted. Sarah reached for another glass of water. "I think you did." Theo tasted a spoonful. A few seconds passed. "I may have." Even Natalie laughed at that. The following morning, she left early for another business conference. As she loaded her suitcase into the car, Theo stepped onto the driveway with 2 travel mugs. "I made coffee. You're becoming predictable." "I take that as a compliment." He handed her a mug. "I've been thinking." Natalie smiled. "That usually means you're about to ask me something. What if we brought back Sunday game nights?" She looked at her calendar. "We can try. No phones. I'll do my best. No work emails." She hesitated just long enough for him to notice. Theo's smile remained warm. "That's exactly why I'm asking." She kissed him before climbing into the driver's seat. "When things settle down, we'll have all the game nights you want." He waved as she drove away. She repeated those words to herself halfway through the trip. When things settle down, they always sounded reasonable. A week later, Natalie stopped by Cynthia's house after work. Her mother answered the door wearing an apron dusted with flour. "You came at the perfect time. Please tell me you're making cinnamon rolls." "I was," Natalie laughed. "The word 'was' worries me. They're slightly darker than I planned. So, well done." "I'm calling them rustic." They both laughed. A little later, they sat at the kitchen table with warm cinnamon rolls and cups of tea. Natalie looked around the familiar room. Very little had changed since she was a little girl. The same clock ticked above the doorway. The same family photographs lined the shelves. Even the tiny scratch on the dining table, where she'd dropped a pair of scissors during a school project, was still there. "You've never replaced this table," Natalie said. Cynthia looked down at it. "It still works." "I suppose it does. You used to build blanket forts under it." Natalie smiled. "I remember getting stuck once." "You absolutely did." Dad laughed before helping me out. "He laughed because you insisted you weren't stuck." "I wasn't." Cynthia raised an eyebrow. "You certainly looked stuck." Natalie laughed again. For a while, they simply enjoyed the quiet. Then Cynthia asked, "How are the children?" "They're busy." "So are you." Natalie nodded. "Work has been demanding." Cynthia reached across the table and gently patted her hand. "You always wanted to give your children every opportunity." "I still do." "You've worked very hard." Natalie looked around the kitchen again. "I just want them to have more than I had." Cynthia smiled, but it wasn't the smile Natalie expected. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. When you think about growing up, what do you remember first?" Natalie thought for a moment. "Dad teaching me to ride my bike." Cynthia nodded. "What else?" "Friday movie nights, the camping trips, baking cookies at Christmas." She smiled as each memory surfaced. "And," Natalie laughed softly, "you making shapeless pancakes." "They are still shapeless." "Oh." Cynthia laughed with her. Then her expression grew thoughtful. "None of those memories cost very much." Natalie leaned back in her chair. "I still wish you and Dad hadn't had to worry about money." Cynthia looked at her daughter with gentle eyes. "Sometimes better isn't the same as more." Natalie sat quietly. The sentence lingered between them. She wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to disagree. Another part wasn't certain she could. When she left that evening, Cynthia hugged her tightly at the front door. "Drive safely." "I will." On the drive home, Natalie found herself thinking about the old kitchen table, about blanket forts, about shapeless pancakes. She smiled at the memories before turning her attention back to the road. By the time she reached home, her phone was already reminding her about the next day's meetings. Life kept moving, the children kept growing, and without anyone intending it, another season quietly slipped by. Time had a way of changing everything without asking permission. Sarah graduated from college on a bright spring afternoon. As she crossed the stage to receive her diploma in art education, Natalie clapped until her hands hurt. "There she is," Theo whispered proudly. "Our little girl." Natalie smiled. "I don't think she's little anymore." After the ceremony, Sarah wrapped both parents in a hug. "I couldn't have done it without you." Theo grinned. "I mostly supplied snacks. You supplied terrible history jokes. They're educational." Sarah laughed. "That's one word for them." Natalie stood watching her daughter surrounded by friends, already talking about her first teaching job. It filled her with pride. A year later, John graduated too. He accepted a position with a local engineering firm and rented a small apartment across town. The move took less than a day. "That's all you're taking?" Natalie asked, looking at the handful of boxes. John shrugged. "I'll probably be back for the coffee maker." Theo folded his arms. "Not mine." John smiled. "I was hoping Mom would talk you into it." Natalie laughed. "You're on your own." The front door closed behind him that afternoon. The house felt different almost immediately. Not lonely, just quieter. There were no soccer cleats left in the hallway. No paintbrushes drying beside the kitchen sink. No voices drifting upstairs late at night. Even the laundry seemed to shrink. A few months passed. Natalie made a decision she had been postponing for years. She stepped down from her executive role and accepted a part-time consulting position instead. The long evenings, the endless travel, the constant meetings. She was ready to leave them behind. When she told Theo, he smiled in a way she hadn't seen for a long time. "So," he said, "does this mean Sunday game night finally stands a chance?" She laughed. "I think Sunday, Monday, and maybe Wednesday. I'll take all three." She imagined weekends filled with family dinners, phone calls, birthday celebrations, the ordinary moments she'd often promised herself would come later. Now later had finally arrived. The following weekend, she invited Sarah and John over for dinner. Sarah couldn't make it. A school fundraiser had been planned months earlier. John was helping a friend move. "No problem," Natalie said over the phone. "We'll do next weekend." Next weekend became the one after that. Then another. Whenever everyone managed to gather, the evenings were warm and full of conversation. But they ended sooner than Natalie expected. Sarah had papers to grade. John had an early meeting. Life, it seemed, had become busy for everyone. One Sunday afternoon, Natalie found herself standing in the grocery store, automatically reaching for Sarah's favorite pasta before remembering she wasn't coming that evening. She stood there for a moment before quietly placing the box back on the shelf. That small gesture stayed with her longer than she expected. Several weeks later, everyone finally gathered around the dining room table. Theo carved the roast, while John talked about a project at work. Sarah described one of her students who insisted the class hamster understood algebra. "I'm not saying he does," Sarah said. "I'm just saying Ethan is convinced." Theo nodded thoughtfully. "I've taught teenagers. Compared to some of them, the hamster has a chance." Everyone laughed. For a while, the evening felt like old times. Then the conversation slowed. Natalie looked around the table. "I've been meaning to ask you both something." Sarah set down her fork. "What is it?" Natalie hesitated. She hadn't planned exactly how to say it. "Did I—" She looked from Sarah to John. "Did I do something wrong?" Neither of them answered. Theo glanced quietly toward the children. The room seemed unusually still. Natalie forced a small smile. "You hardly visit. I don't want you to feel guilty. I just wonder if I've missed something." Sarah lowered her eyes for a moment. When she looked up again, her voice was calm. "Mom." She reached across the table and gently touched Natalie's hand. "We never wanted a bigger life." Natalie frowned slightly. Sarah took a slow breath. "We just wanted more time with you." The words settled quietly over the table. No anger, no blame, just honesty. John nodded. I never questioned how much you loved us. He smiled sadly. We always felt loved. Natalie blinked. Then, he searched for the right words. We missed having you there. She looked at him without speaking. The soccer games weren't really about soccer. John gave a small laugh. I used to keep looking toward the parking lot. Sarah smiled gently. I always saved you a seat. Natalie's heart tightened. The art show. Sarah nodded. I thought maybe you'd make it at the last minute. Theo reached for Natalie's hand beneath the table. She hadn't realized he was holding it until then. I thought I was giving you everything, she said quietly. You were, Sarah answered. You gave us opportunities. John smiled. You gave us a wonderful home. Sarah squeezed her mother's hand. We just missed sharing more of it with you. No one spoke for several moments. Outside, the evening settled over the neighborhood. Inside, the dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same table, the same family photographs, the same laughter waiting somewhere beneath the silence. For the first time in many years, Natalie found herself wondering if there had been something she had been chasing for so long that she had never stopped to ask what her children had wanted all along. The conversation around the dinner table stayed with Natalie long after the dishes had been washed and everyone had gone home. She replayed Sarah's words while folding laundry. She heard John's voice while making coffee. Neither of them had sounded angry. That was the part she couldn't stop thinking about. They had simply told her the truth. Several weeks later, Natalie called Cynthia. Are you busy today? I was planning to argue with the weeds in the garden. Natalie smiled. Who was winning? The weeds. They always do. Can I come over? Of course. By late morning, Natalie pulled into the familiar driveway. Nothing had changed very much. The flower pots still sat beside the front steps. The wind chimes still danced softly whenever the breeze picked up. Cynthia opened the door before Natalie reached it. I had a feeling you'd arrive hungry. You always say that. And I'm usually right. You usually are. The smell of homemade vegetable soup drifted through the house. After lunch, Cynthia carried their bowls to the sink. I'm going to start the dishwasher. Natalie nodded. I think I'll look around for a minute. Take your time. Natalie wandered slowly through the house. Her old bedroom was now a sewing room, but the closet door still squeaked the same way it always had. She smiled without thinking. In the hallway, family photographs filled the wall. There she was, with missing front teeth. Another showed her holding the fish she and her father had caught during a camping trip. One picture captured all three of them laughing so hard that no one had looked at the camera. She couldn't even remember why they were laughing, only that they had. In the living room, she opened an old wooden cabinet. Inside were stacks of recipe cards, written in Cynthia's careful handwriting. Some had little notes in the corners. Too much cinnamon. Theo likes this one. Make extra for Natalie. She smiled. Beneath the recipe cards sat a worn cardboard box. Inside were old board game score sheets. Most of the numbers were crossed out because someone had made mistakes. One page had Dad cheated, written across the top in a child's handwriting. Natalie laughed out loud. I absolutely did not. Her father's voice seemed to echo in her memory. You moved your piece. I adjusted my piece. That's moving it. She could almost hear the laughter around the table. Cynthia walked into the room carrying 2 fresh cups of tea. What did you find? Natalie held up the score sheet. You kept these? I never throw away happy memories. Natalie looked around the room. So many ordinary things. Cynthia sat beside her. Those ordinary things kept us busy for years. Natalie traced her finger over the faded handwriting. I spent so much time thinking I didn't have enough. Cynthia was quiet. I kept trying to give Sarah and John everything I thought I'd missed. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. And what did you actually miss? Natalie opened her mouth to answer. Nothing came. Instead, memories appeared one after another. Movie nights, camping trips, shapeless pancakes, blanket forts, birthday cakes made at home, long walks with her father, late-night conversations with Cynthia when she couldn't sleep. She let out a slow breath. I didn't miss any of it. Cynthia smiled. No, I just thought I had. They sat together without speaking for a while. Neither of them needed to fill the silence. Later that afternoon, Natalie hugged her mother goodbye and started the drive home. Instead of taking the usual route, she found herself turning toward the road she hadn't traveled in years. A few minutes later, she slowed near the familiar black iron gates of St. Joseph's Academy. School had just begun for the day. Children climbed out of polished cars, carrying backpacks that looked much like the ones she had admired as a little girl. Parents waved goodbye. Teachers greeted students by name. Everything looked just as perfect as she remembered. Natalie stayed, parked across the street for a few minutes. Then she noticed something she had never seen as a child. One little boy climbed reluctantly from the back seat. A girl looked upset about something and wiped her eyes before walking inside. Another child laughed while chasing a friend toward the entrance. Some children looked excited. Others looked tired. One looked nervous. It suddenly seemed so obvious. They were simply children, just like she had been. She smiled softly. All those years ago, she had believed she was looking at perfect lives. She had never stopped to consider that every family carried joys and struggles no one else could see. As she drove away, another thought settled into her mind. Her parents had never given her the most expensive childhood. They had given her a happy one. She thought about Sarah and John, about the choices she had made, about the promises she had kept. For the first time, she stopped blaming herself for working so hard. She had done it out of love. She simply hadn't understood that love sometimes looks different than we imagine. The road home stretched ahead of her. Natalie rolled down the window and let the afternoon air fill the car. She couldn't change yesterday, but tomorrow still belonged to her. The following morning, Natalie sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. Theo walked in, looked at her untouched mug, and smiled. Thinking? A little. That's usually a good sign. She looked up at him. I've been trying to figure out how to fix everything. Theo pulled out a chair. And? I don't think I can. He nodded. Maybe you don't have to. She frowned. What do you mean? You can't go back and attend the soccer games you missed. No. You can't sit in the chair at Sarah's art show. She slowly shook her head. But you can decide what kind of mother you'll be today. The words stayed with her after Theo left to meet a retired colleague for breakfast. That afternoon, Natalie picked up her phone. She typed a message to Sarah. Would you like to have lunch this weekend? Just the two of us. A reply came a few minutes later. I'd love that. Natalie smiled. No long explanation, no expensive plans, just lunch. The restaurant Sarah chose was a small cafe with mismatched chairs and homemade soup. I thought you'd pick somewhere fancier, Natalie admitted. Sarah laughed. I come here because they know my name. They're already ahead of me. They also make excellent grilled cheese. Natalie looked around. It does smell good. After they ordered, she took a slow breath. I've wanted to say something. Sarah waited. I'm sorry. She looked directly at her daughter. I spent so many years trying to give you every opportunity that I didn't always give you enough of myself. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she reached across the table. Thank you for saying that. Natalie felt tears threatening, but she smiled instead. I don't expect everything to change overnight. It doesn't have to. They spent the rest of lunch talking about Sarah's students, funny stories from school, and a classroom goldfish that somehow escaped its bowl twice in 1 week. I still don't know how he did it, Sarah said. Natalie laughed. Perhaps he's planning an adventure. He's very ambitious. The conversation felt easy. not because they ignored the past, because they weren't trying to solve it all at once. A couple of weeks later, Sarah called. "What are you doing Saturday?" "Nothing important. Would you like to paint with me?" Natalie blinked. "You mean actually paint?" Sarah laughed. "That's usually how it works. I should warn you, my artistic talent peaked with stick figures. I'll lower my expectations." Saturday afternoon found them sitting in Sarah's backyard with paintbrushes and blank canvases. Natalie's tree looked more like a giant broccoli. Sarah tried not to laugh. "I'm sorry. You absolutely are not. I'm really not." Soon they were both laughing so hard that Natalie accidentally dipped her brush into her cup of tea instead of the paint. "Well," Sarah said, "that's a new technique. It probably won't catch on." When they packed everything away, Natalie realized 3 hours had passed. She hadn't looked at her phone once. The following week, John called. "Mum." "Hi, sweetheart. A group of us is helping clean up the neighborhood park on Saturday." "That sounds nice. You don't have to," he hesitated. "But if you'd like to come, I'd love to." Saturday morning, they planted flowers, picked up litter, and repaired old picnic tables. John worked beside her most of the day. At one point he looked over and smiled. "You know, you're pretty good with a paintbrush." Natalie laughed. "You should ask your sister before saying that." "I'm talking about fences." "Oh. Your trees still need work." She nudged his shoulder. "I knew there was a catch." When they stopped for sandwiches, John began telling stories about work, his apartment, and the neighbor who has to greet everyone 3 times a day. Natalie mostly listened. She realized how much she still had to learn about her son's life. That evening, Theo noticed something different. "You hardly talked all through dinner." Natalie looked surprised. "Was I supposed to?" "You usually ask a question and then answer it yourself." "I do not." "You do." She thought about it. "I might." Theo smiled. "Tonight you listened. And it suited you." Over the following months, family dinners slowly found their way back. Not every week. Sometimes schedules still got in the way. But when they happened, no one hurried through them. They lingered over dessert. They argued about board game rules. John still claimed Theo cheated at cards. "I learned from the best," Theo replied. "I've never cheated." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "We've all played Monopoly with you." Everyone laughed. Natalie looked around the table. There were no grand celebrations, no expensive gifts, just familiar voices filling the house again. She thought about all the years she had believed the biggest moments mattered most. Now she found herself looking forward to ordinary afternoons, shared meals, and conversations that wandered wherever they pleased. Little by little, something precious was growing, not because anyone had forgotten the past, but because they had chosen to keep showing up for one another. And in that moment, Natalie began to believe that perhaps motherhood wasn't measured by the moments she had missed, but by the love she was still willing to give. A few years passed, and life settled into a rhythm Natalie no longer tried to control. Sarah married a fellow teacher who loved books almost as much as she did. Before long, they welcomed a little girl named Leah, who inherited her mother's curiosity and her grandfather Theo's gift for asking endless questions. John married too, and he and his wife soon became parents to a cheerful little boy named Caleb. He seemed determined to climb everything he could reach, including furniture that clearly wasn't designed for climbing. "That child has springs in his shoes," Theo said one afternoon as Caleb scrambled onto a porch swing. "I think he gets it from you," Sarah replied. "I've never climbed furniture." "You've considered it. I won't deny that." Laughter came easily in the Anderson family these days. One warm Saturday afternoon, everyone gathered at Natalie and Theo's home for lunch. Nothing about the day was elaborate. Theo grilled hamburgers in the backyard while pretending he had invented barbecue. "I expect everyone to compliment the chef," he announced. John took one bite. "I've had better." Theo looked offended. "From where?" "My own grill. You are no longer my favorite son. I'm your only son. Details. The grandchildren giggled, even though they weren't quite old enough to understand why everyone else was laughing. Inside, Sarah arranged bowls of potato salad and fruit on the table, while Natalie carried out a pan of homemade cinnamon rolls. Theo smiled the moment he saw them. "Your mother's recipe?" Natalie nodded. "Exactly the same." "Did you burn them?" "I was tempted." Sarah laughed. Grandma Cynthia would be proud. The words warmed Natalie more than she expected. After lunch, Caleb wanted someone to kick a soccer ball with him. John stood up. "I've got this." Caleb looked at Natalie. "Grandma, you too." She glanced at John. "I might be a little rusty." "You'll be fine." They wandered into the backyard together. Caleb chased the ball with endless energy, while Natalie and John laughed every time it rolled in the wrong direction. When they finally sat down on the grass to catch their breath, Caleb ran off to inspect a line of ants marching along the fence. John leaned back on his hands. "You know something?" "What?" "My favorite memories weren't the big vacations." Natalie looked at him. "They weren't." He smiled. "I remember teaching me to ride my bike." She laughed softly. "I wasn't very good at it. You kept letting go too soon. I thought confidence would help. It mostly helped me fall into bushes." She covered her face, laughing. "I'd forgotten that." "I haven't." He smiled. "I remember making pancakes on Saturday mornings." "You mean watching your father make pancakes?" "You were there." He looked toward Caleb. "The days we were all together are the ones I remember most." Natalie sat quietly. Those were the very moments she had once believed were too ordinary to matter. Later that afternoon, while everyone lingered around the table with slices of pie and cups of coffee, Sarah sat beside her. "I've been meaning to tell you something." Natalie turned toward her. "I'm listening." Sarah smiled. "Thank you." "For what?" "For never giving up." Natalie looked puzzled. "There was a time when it would have been easier to pretend everything was fine." Sarah reached for her mother's hand. "But you didn't. You listened. You showed up. You stayed." Natalie's eyes filled. "I wish I'd figured it out sooner." Sarah gently squeezed her hand. "So do I." Then she smiled. "But I'm really glad you figured it out at all." Across the table, Theo was losing another card game to Cynthia, who had come for lunch carrying her famous apple pie. "I think you're making up the rules," Theo complained. Cynthia laughed. "I've been using the same rules for a century." "That doesn't mean they're fair." John looked over. "Dad just doesn't like losing. I object to this family ganging up on me." No one paid much attention. Even Theo started laughing. Natalie leaned back in her chair and looked around the room. 3 generations, conversations happening all at once, children running through the backyard, the smell of fresh coffee, the sound of people who enjoyed simply being together. Without thinking, she remembered the little girl who used to stop outside the gates of St. Joseph's Academy. She had believed happiness lived behind expensive walls. She had spent years trying to recreate a picture she barely understood. Only now did she see what her parents had quietly given her all along. Movie nights, camping trips, shapeless pancakes, board games, long conversations around an old kitchen table. None of those memories had needed replacing. They had simply needed appreciating. Natalie silently thanked her parents for giving her a childhood she had misunderstood for so many years. She looked at Sarah helping Leah wipe flour from her hands after making cookies. She watched John lifting Caleb high into the air, while Theo pretended the little boy had become too heavy overnight. There wasn't a single expensive gift in sight. No one seemed to notice. No one cared. At last, Natalie understood something she could never have understood as a little girl standing outside those school gates. Love is rarely remembered for what it buys. It is remembered for who was there. The afternoon slowly turned into evening, yet no one seemed eager to leave. Someone started another pot of coffee. The grandchildren invented a game with cardboard boxes. Theo suggested one more round of cards, even though everyone knew he would probably lose again. Natalie smiled as the conversations continued around her. For years, she had believed she was chasing the perfect childhood for her children. Instead, she had discovered something far more valuable. The richest moments had never been waiting somewhere else. They had been here all along, gathered around an ordinary table with the people she loved most. Sometimes we spend years trying to give our loved ones a perfect life, only to discover they were never asking for perfection. They were simply hoping we'd stay long enough to make ordinary moments unforgettable.